Whether you support them or not, the rules on face coverings are back again as of 4 AM this morning, 30th of November. That means for the next 3 weeks at least, it is once again mandatory to wear a face mask in places such as shops, other settings such as banks, post offices, hairdressers, as well as on public transport. As for public transport, this is also being enforced by way of a condition of carriage, which means when you use public transport, you are entering into a contract to use that transport, and wearing a mask is part of the contract. All of this, of course, unless you are exempt from wearing one, which would include any kind of breathing difficulties, mental illness, or other physical disability that would prevent you from wearing a mask. But I can certainly see some issues with this, which I will discuss a little bit later in the video, so make sure you watch till the end. So welcome back. I am the Black Belt Barrister, helping you to understand law on this channel, so please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on future videos. So that's right, the rules are back with face masks, and you must wear them in shops, other places, and on public transport unless you have an exemption from doing so. If you are exempt from wearing one and you want to avoid the difficult conversation as to why you are not wearing one, you can download and carry with you an exemption card, although this is a personal choice. Now, there is some guidance for shops and other places, but again, as I said, this doesn't come without its difficulties, which I'm going to explain later. But as a starting point where shops are concerned, if a customer refuses to wear a face covering on the premises and they don't have an exemption, then the shop is entitled to refuse that customer entry and ask them to leave the premises. They can, in the worst circumstances, call the police and ask the police to remove you from the premises. And again, just to restate it, retailers do not have any legal power to enforce the wearing of a face covering on their premises, although they may simply refuse you entry. The police, however, do have some formal enforcement powers in that they can issue you with a fine. And going on the previous publications, this would be £200 for the first offence, lowered to £100 if paid within 14 days, but £400 for a second offence, and then doubling up to a maximum of £6,400. Again, this is important for reasons I will come back to later in the video. And just as a side note, those figures were for England. For Wales, it was slightly different in that it was £60 for the first offence, lowered to £30 if paid within 14 days, £120 for the second offence, and every further offence. In Scotland, although as a disclaimer, I don't practice in Scotland, but the published fines were £60 for the first offence, lowered to £30 if paid within 28 days, £120 for the second offence, then doubling for every further offence up to a maximum of £960. Northern Ireland, with a similar disclaimer, £60 for the first offence, lowered to £30 if paid within 14 days, £120 for the second offence, then doubling for every further offence up to a maximum again of £960. But as I said, there are potentially a number of problems with this, focusing sadly on those who have disabilities or other conditions that would prevent them from wearing a mask and give them a valid exemption. The obvious difficulty being those with a valid exemption may find it difficult to even explain that they have an exemption, much less want to talk about it in the first place. But conversely, there may well be lots of people that simply say they have an exemption when in fact they don't. But sticking with those that do have a valid exemption, there are a number of legal issues that arise. Taking, for example, some of those discussed in the government's response to the COVID-19 fixed penalty notices, which you can find on the parliamentary website. There are several human rights issues addressed, which I will give you a brief summary of here, which in fact I did a short segment for, which featured on fellow YouTuber Alex Belfield's channel earlier this morning. So make sure you check out his take on it as well. So the first issue raised is the right to private and family life, which is Article 8 of ECHR. In other words, the restrictions may have an effect on curtailing the right to have a private and family life. Although this is a qualified right which can be interfered with if there is a legitimate reason and it is proportionate and necessary in the circumstances. Although it should also contain sufficient exemptions so as not to disproportionately affect certain groups of people, particularly those with disabilities and other conditions that would prevent them from wearing a mask. The next issue arises under Article 7, which is that there should be no punishment without law. Article 7 provides that no one shall be held guilty of any criminal offence on account of any act or omission which does not constitute a criminal offence at the time when it was committed. So in other words, if someone with a valid exemption is fined and found criminally liable for not wearing a mask or complying with any other restriction for that matter, this is potentially a breach of Article 7 in that no one should be held guilty of a criminal offence for any act or omission which did not constitute a criminal offence. So in other words, if they have a valid exemption for not wearing the mask, and yet they are fined for doing so, this may well be a breach of this article. The next issue looked at in the government response was the right to a fair trial contained in Article 6. Now, insofar as fixed penalties are concerned, they were used as an enforcement tool since they were introduced in the 1950s, but predominantly for simple motoring offences such as not wearing your seatbelt. Other offences included littering, graffiti, and things of this nature. And whilst they are criminal in nature, they are designed to levy a small fine rather than a full prosecution. However, as noted in the government response, it is questionable as to whether these fines for the COVID restrictions, once they raise to the maximum amounts, such as £6,400 in England, can be fairly addressed as a fixed penalty, or whether it is denying the right to a fair trial. Of course, there are many types of offences which carry a maximum of £1,000 fine, but in reality, if a person gets to court and is convicted of said offence, will usually receive a much smaller fine, maybe £100 or £200, as against the potential £1,000 fine available. But in this situation, if the police are given no discretion with which value to issue this fixed penalty for, being that the first offence, second offence, and then doubling thereafter, for example, this would raise the concern about the proportionality of the level of fine issued and whether or not it is denying the right to a fair trial under Article 6. And last but certainly not least, Article 14 of ECHR provides the principle of non-discrimination in the enjoyment of other human rights. Now, given, as I said, there are going to be many situations where someone does have a valid exemption to wearing a mask, but perhaps cannot explain it or doesn't want to explain it, and perhaps shouldn't need to explain it, and therefore may as a result face ill treatment and discrimination. So may I take this opportunity to ask all of you watching that whilst you are out and about, if you see someone who is not wearing a mask, please don't pass judgment or hold that person in contempt, because it will be virtually impossible for you to know whether they have a valid exemption for wearing the mask or not. And for those of you watching that do have a valid exemption, I would encourage you to be strong and carry with you an exemption card so that you can at least show someone if you are questioned as to why you are not wearing one when you are out in shops and other places. So in the meantime, please stay safe, keep watching and subscribe.